One really chilling and concerning thing that we've heard coming out of the government in Israel is various ministers making threats to use nuclear weapons against Gaza and to annihilate the entire population there of around over 2 million people. Andrew, could you tell us about what nuclear capabilities does Israel have and how have they developed that capability?
Key to Israel developing its nuclear capability was an extraordinary thing that happened in the 1970s. And I was living in South Africa at the time. South Africa was an apartheid state. And we had a prime minister called B.J. Vorster, who had been interned during the Second World War because he was part of the leadership of an informal militia that was pro the Nazis. He formed part of the government immediately after the Second World War, the government that implemented the most extreme form of apartheid that South Africa saw. And because my mother was a Holocaust survivor, we used to travel to Israel quite often and we'd visit Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial. But there I was one day when I was quite young, sat in front of the television, watching Prime Minister B.J. Vorster arriving in Israel. And the first place they took him was to Yad Vashem to pay his respects to the victims of the Holocaust. And I sat there thinking to myself, but my mom told me that this guy was actually jailed during the Second World War because he was a Nazi. And now here he is pretending to be deeply troubled by the 6 million Jews and 6 million other people who were killed by the Nazis. And I found an extraordinary dissonance around that. What I didn't know at the time, but found out subsequently through a brilliant book written by someone called Sasha Polakow-Suransky, called The Unspoken Alliance, is on that trip, B.J. Vorster met with the then Israeli prime minister, I think he was, and I think it was Shimon Peres. And that meeting led to apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel deciding to assist each other to become nuclear powers. So we had these two pariah nations in the world. And at that point in history, one was allowed to call them pariah nations without being called an anti-Semite, which is the way in which, unfortunately, that debate has gone currently. But these two pariah nations therefore became nuclear states that meant their negotiating position vis-a-vis the United States of America, which supported both of them, it should be noted, was much more powerful. And of course, their role in their regions now became stratospherically more dangerous. If we put that reality together with the nature of Israel's current government that is waging this brutality in Gaza, we have a truly terrifying situation. Because I've done a piece for Double Down News that people might be interested in that goes into the characteristics of this current Israeli government. The reality is it is the most extremist, openly, proudly fascist government in Israel's history. There are a number of people in this government as ministers, people like Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, who idolizes an illegal settler from Hebron who shot dead more than 20 Palestinians one morning because he felt like it. And the illegal settlement on which Ben-Gvir comes from actually has a shrine to Baruch Goldstein, the murderer. Ben-Gvir regards Goldstein's mentor, an extreme rabbi who was charged with terrorism offenses in the United States of America. Ben-Gvir regards him as his political mentor. And Gvir was one of the people who 3 days before the assassination of the Israeli prime minister who signed the Oslo Peace Accords, Yitzhak Rabin, Ben-Gvir was the man who had stolen from Rabin's car a religious ornament. And he stood shouting to a group of extremists, "Today we have got to his car. Tomorrow we get to Rabin." And 3 days later, he was assassinated. So, these are people who in any normal functioning democratic state with a functioning legal system would be in jail rather than occupying some of the most senior positions in government, positions that are determining the sort of warfare that Israel is conducting in Gaza. These are the people who effectively are going to have to decide whether to use nuclear weapons or not. And that turns what is effectively a genocide in Gaza into an existential crisis, not just for Palestinians, not just for all of those who support Palestine around the world, not just for the international rule of law, but literally, it could potentially be an existential threat to humanity. Because if Israel is pushed onto the defensive sufficiently, it is led by people who are clinically insane enough to actually use those nuclear weapons.
And Andrew, I think I'm right in saying that at some point Britain was actually involved in supplying certain materials to Israel that were very useful for its development of nuclear weapons. I think some declassified files have come out about that several years ago. And also, I wrote an article based on files that I found at the National Archives, which showed just how much inside the UK Foreign Office there is a strong belief that Israel has nuclear weapons, because, of course, officially, Israel hasn't declared that it has a nuclear capability, but everyone kind of knows it has one. And the UK government kind of help Israel maintain this charade by saying in public, Israel's never declared a nuclear program, so they don't condemn them for it, even though Iran is condemned, even though it hasn't yet developed the capability. Iraq, of course, was invaded illegally, largely on the lie that it had weapons of mass destruction. And some of the files that I found, they show. So in one case in the early 90s, a diplomat called Simon Fraser said that the Israelis are, after all, probably the world's greatest proliferators of nuclear weapons. And Simon Fraser went on to become the head of the Foreign Office from 2010 to 2015. So he was the UK's top diplomat, and that was privately his belief, although publicly he would never say that. Another colleague in Tel Aviv in the 90s, a diplomat called Andrew Pierce, he said Israel is almost certainly a nuclear weapons possessor. And going back even further in the archives into the early 80s, Ministry of Defense files, marked secret, showed that they believed Israel probably produces enough plutonium for one nuclear weapon per year, and thus she may now have a stock of about 20, having gone into production around 1964. And the reason they seem to not state this publicly is because they say openly admitting our suspicions would create pressure for action against Israel, which would be difficult to satisfy. Because, of course, they're precedent for states in the Middle East that have developed nuclear weapons without their permission. In the case of Iraq, as we've said, it's invasion. In the case of Iran, it's crippling sanctions. So they are clearly aware of this double standard, and yet they want to carry on giving Israel diplomatic cover to develop and possess these weapons.
The extraordinary thing is that we do this as the UK, and of course the US leads on all of this. And the UK acts as a very willing and obedient poodle on an enormous amount of this. But we as Britons have a responsibility to call our own government to account in this regard. But we have all of this that you have just mentioned, and the British government seems completely incapable of in any way reining in the Israeli government. So it feels as though, the US and UK governments, if they wanted to, could take action against Israel's nuclear arsenal, could take action in terms of forcing a ceasefire in Gaza today, where a child's being killed every 5 minutes, but has absolutely no political will to do so. So we are effectively endangering the entire planet because of our totally uncritical and unquestioning support of Israel at a time when its government is the most out of control it has ever had since the Israeli state came into being, which is a truly terrifying prospect.